Halfway through 2021, it was announced that ground-penetrating radar had located the remains of 215 missing children in an apple orchard on the site of a former residential school. This inspired me to wonder, what were residential schools actually like? Residential schools were a network of boarding schools for Indigenous children that existed in Canada from the 1880s to the 1990s. Run by the government and churches, its purpose was to assimilate Indigenous children by erasing their cultures, languages, and identities. Life in residential schools were marked by strict discipline, poor living conditions, and emotional and physical abuse. Children were isolated from their families and forbidden from speaking their native languages. Many suffered long-term psychological damage. The moment a child entered the building of a residential school, their hair would be cut short and they would be assigned numbers to get rid of their past names. Children faced half days of education because it was believed that labor could earn a better wage than being properly educated, so the other half went towards work and chores. In terms of learning in the classrooms, most of the students had the same knowledge worth as a 5th grader of today by the time they turned 18. Girls had to sew, cook, and clean, where boys had carpentry, tinsmithing, and farming. Dormitories and rooms were always overcrowded. The lack of healthcare resulted in a lot of deaths related to disease, such as tuberculosis. For breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all they got were malnutritious meals. They weren't allowed to speak in their native language or talk to their siblings if they were in the same school. Punishments included being tied to a bed, shut in a closet, or having to eat soap. A devastating statistic to reflect on is that at least 6,000 children died while attending residential schools, though this number could potentially be much higher due to missing records. If this number is compared to the number of children that actually attended residential schools, which is about 150,000, then that means 1 in 25 students died at these schools. For comparison, 1 in 26 of Canadian soldiers who participated in World War II were killed. It's important to note that not everybody had bad experiences. Some reported to have positive experiences, saying that there was a sense of structure that helped them to grow. Others said it was the only place they could go to and that they were grateful that they were accepted. Certain schools weren't harsh and offered opportunities like sports, which was fun for the students. However, these rare occurrences still do not erase the overall cultural loss. Reflecting on the stories of survivors is essential. Listening to these voices brings greater understanding of the intergenerational trauma that continues to affect Indigenous communities today. It emphasizes the importance of preserving Indigenous identities. Residential schools are a crucial part of Canada's reconciliation process. The legacy of these institutions persists in the form of social and health issues, including higher rates of mental health disorders, addiction, and suicide among Indigenous peoples. We must continue working towards healing and rebuilding trust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. When we talk about the lasting impact of Indigenous residential schools, we must also talk about the actions needed to fix it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission outlined 94 calls to action, each addressing different topics of the harm caused to Indigenous peoples and the steps needed to move forward. There are 2 calls to actions that fit in with my project. Call to action number 11 highlights the need to provide adequate funding for First Nations students seeking post-secondary education. It recognizes the underfunding and lack of resources in residential schools. Today, this call wants us to invest $150.6 million in education for the Indigenous, ensuring that denial of quality education isn't repeated. Its current status is in progress with projects proposed. Call to action number 80 states, establish a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation as a statutory holiday. It is a day to honor survivors and the children who never came home from residential schools. On March 9, 2023, its status was marked as complete after it was set to be on September 30 every year. The daily life in residential schools was structured to strip away the identity of Indigenous children through a combination of religious teachings, labor, and separation from their families. The trauma of these experiences has had lasting effects on survivors and their communities. As we reflect on its history, it's important to recognize the resilience of those who survived, and to support the current efforts for truth, reconciliation, and healing.